This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
The reason that Jerome was at Royal Holloway a few weeks ago was his remaking history, the past in contemporary historical fictions. But today he's going to talk about double helix history, DNA and genealogy.
Right, yeah, so it's very nice to be here. As I say, I always find that myself feeling a little nervous when I come into this institute because I feel like I'm going to get told off. But it's nice to think about this material from a very specifically historical context. And thank you very much for inviting me to come to this seminar, which is, I think, very important. As Nicholas says, what I spent most of my career over the last 10 years, I guess, doing is thinking about how people get their history, how people access history, a variety of ways that they understand history to act in their lives. And what that's got me to at the moment is an interest in genealogy, and particularly an interest in family history. How it's undertaken, who undertakes it, why, what it might mean for their sense of the past, their sense of themselves in relation to the past, what it means for things like nationhood and identity, ethnic grouping, gender, race, class, all the other things, some of which I'm going to talk about today. So that's the kind of context, that this is an investigation into how these specific practices might kind of affect people's ways of thinking about history and their own place in it. So I wrote something about that last year, and I'm still trying to work through some of those ideas, and some of those ideas come up in this. But what that's got me to even further away from literature is the use of DNA testing and sequencing in history, but particularly in family history, and the uses that people make of it and how it's done. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some general ideas of how DNA and genetic science figure in the public historical imagination. Then I'm going to talk specifically about how it works in DNA testing for genealogy. And then I'm going to give you a case study of how it works, which is me. Because I had my DNA sequenced about a year ago. So for the causes of historical investigation. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that, which it is quite peculiar to think about that, and I'm quite excited to think about the consequences of literally putting your money where your mouth is, and putting yourself in your work. So we should maybe talk about that in questions. So does that sound all right as a way forward? And there aren't that many images, and they're not particularly important, but they're just nice to have there when I get boring. So genealogy then is one of the biggest activities on the planet, generally undertaken via massive gateway websites like Ancestry.com that you probably come across, Find My Past, Genes Reunited. Ancestry.com argues that it's got 14 billion family history records, which I don't quite think can be true, but 60 million member trees. It's got this enormous amount of information, it claims. And involves investigators formulating a family tree, imagining their relationship to the past accordingly. And increasingly these websites are adding something to their armoury, which is DNA sequencing. The armchair genealogist investigates the past by spitting in a tube, and the creation of huge repositories and databases of DNA information about database users allows for data analysis to be undertaken, quite sophisticated analysis, leading to a kind of scientific speculation about the ancestry of the individual. So what I'm going to do in this paper is sort of think about this intersection of genetic science and popular narratives of the self and the past. Think about how this science is represented, how it's visualised, what it means for privacy, what it means about the self, what the imaginative implications are of this kind of sharing of DNA data, what kind of identity it might give to the user. And I'm going to think, as I said, about certain types of DNA history, and think about how this relates to genealogy. My first example then is Richard III, so nearly literature. The most public example to date of the use of DNA in genealogical verification and testing, this moment when science and history came together most clearly in the public imagination. The discovery, exhumation and examination of the medieval king's remains in 2012 was a very big popular phenomenon. but also had significant scholarly impact in many different fields. After much prompting by the Richard III Society, the project led to the collaboration between archaeologists, the City of Leicester, DNA scientists, geneticists at the University of Leicester, and amateur members of the Richard III Society, who up to this point, had been kind of dismissed as cranks. And this collaboration itself asked serious questions about professionalisation, particularly as these non-specialists, the Richard III Society, played quite a significant role in shaping the intellectual framework of this project. The identification of the site and the remains involved a deal of archaeological science, including the deployment of ground-penetrating radar and radiocarbon dating. And it involved a series of popular discussions in the press and beyond about the nature of lineage, the contemporary world's relationship with heritage, and the ethics of disinterring human remains. The status of the skeleton itself became a legal cause célèbre, and you may remember in 2012, 2013, the body of the king was kind of was the site of a wrangling about where it would rest after it was dug up and identified. It was reinterred after a year of legal wrangling in Leicester Cathedral, and this legal wrangling included a final judicial review and a decision made by the High Court. So the kind of argument went all the way. This is the memorial service, is what it was called. So there was a week of kind of commemoration. They very carefully didn't call it a reburial because the body had already been buried, but it was called a reburial in media reports. If you look at any media report, it's called a reburial. And there are media reports around the world, from the States to North Africa to Australia. It really made quite a significant impact. There were 5 days of events celebrating this reinterment, and they situated, therefore, the event at an intersection of heritage performance and reenactment. He went to Bosworth Field, and nationalistic memorial service. The procession toward the final rest, or what we might think is the final rest, was attended by thousands of onlookers as the coffin processed through Leicester town centre. Much was made of the role of the descendants of the king, as they laid white Yorkist roses upon his coffin at the beginning of this procession. And then they went to Bosworth Battlefield Heritage Centre, obviously where he died, and then were led out into the field of Bosworth by reenactors dressed as knights. At the final service, they took a week going around this. And as you can see, it massively popularly supported. Benedict Cumberbatch read a poem written by the poet laureate Carol Ann Duffy, which was afterwards published in The Guardian. And Duffy's poem is a sonnet, 14-line poem, historically inflected form that lives with multiple echoes. People have written sonnets for centuries, and sonnets refer to themselves very consciously, very clearly. It's surely meant to briefly recall, obviously as a form, the most famous of Richard's writers, that is William Shakespeare, who's most famously the most famous sonneteer of the lot, really, outside of literature studies. And this sonnet refers to the strangeness of this moment. And so these are the closing lines. Or I once dreamed of this, the speaker is Richard, or considered to be Richard. I once dreamed of this, your future breath, in prayer for me lost long forever found, or sensed you from the backstage of my death, as kings glimpse shadows on a battleground. Duffy here presents a series of paradoxes, solid dreams, shadow glimpses and losses found. The substantial is made ethereal and ghostly. The poem's infused with Shakespeare, particularly the idea of what is lost being found, which is obviously from The Winter's Tale. That's the name, both a line from the Winter's Tale, but also the name Perdita, the key character there. But his influence is particularly invoked in the backstage of my death, a kind of afterlife place suggesting a relationship between the death event, the afterlife representation, and the current moment of ceremony. The poem explicitly references the actuality of Richard's body being brought up from the mud in almost sublime terms. My bones scripted in light upon cold soil, a human braille. And the sense of the interrelationship between language, skeleton, writing, and mud, and also then braille, figures the complexity of Richard in the now as a thing and a dream, something imagined, a ghost. And the fact that it's braille, I think, is really amazing, because it's about absence, isn't it? It's about indentation. It's not a scripted language in a textualised way. So as a public poem, it's complex and uncanny. It's strange, and moving and very modern, I think, but clearly playing around with ideas of commemoration and ghostliness and echo. So the investigation into Richard III's remains is a very complex project intellectually, scientifically and ethically. The work on the DNA of the skeleton was crucial in establishing, with other historical information, the veracity of the bones. And they took on a kind of material substance. They moved from being remains to being Richard III. So they took on this kind of quality, this aura even, of something as the DNA work was done. They've shifted in their physical nature then. What this investigation might mean in terms of popular genealogical historiography and the appreciation of DNA science is also important to outline. The event highlighted an increasingly important aspect of the configuration of memory and history in the cultural imagination, that is, the decisive contribution of science to establishing fact. This might be seen most recently, literally the last couple of weeks, in Mary Beard's Pompeii, New Secrets Revealed, in which the human plasticasts made at the site were investigated using a CT scanner and an X-ray machine. And science increasingly becomes an arbiter of truth in these popular discussions, allowing new and decisive interventions on the behalf of the historian. I pulled this up when I was looking for an image and was quite disturbed by this image. This is a published image from the BBC website, which, given the long and complex discussions in archaeological circles about disinterring human remains, this seems incredibly tasteless as a piece of publicity. Anyway. At a time when the pseudo-scientific foundations of much modern historiography are either being revised or challenged, the entrance of actual science into the discussion presents an enormous and complex challenge to the profession. This shift is in many ways being driven by scientists themselves. The conflation of DNA and history has become increasingly common. The conflation of particular sequencing techniques with statistical analysis and geographical information to make assertions about history of the kind is quite regularly invoked by scientists. So, for instance, and this is nearly kind of random from Google Scholar, Monica Sands and her team worked on the history of one particular Native American village in Uruguay in order to draw conclusions about immigration and lineage. Their investigation involved studying the mitochondrial DNA of present-day inhabitants and thereby extrapolating data to analyse what might have been the case in the 1830s. And they argue that, quote, "This is the first time that a native descendant origin population from Uruguay has been analysed, and the results provide new information about the historic process of formation of the population." Now, quite a lot of genetic work that's done is archaeological work, and it's done in prehistory, but these two examples, Richard III and this one, is very clearly kind of in the modern, in a history moment. So I find it quite troubling that science is making kind of quite grand claims without really reflecting upon what they're doing. Genetic scientists are increasingly analysing DNA taken from archaeological finds to make assertions about the development and migration of populations, and particularly about how languages in Europe became established. So, for instance, recently, teams in Harvard and Cambridge looked at human remains dating back 8,000 years over a kind of semi-linked project. Harvard, they looked at remains dating back 8,000 years, Copenhagen over 5,500 years. The Danish team sequenced the entire genome of 101 skeletons. And the teams argued that the enrichment techniques they use can allow them to read what they call ancient DNA libraries in a much fuller way. I think I have a slide of this, yeah. Enrichment of these positions decreases the sequencing required for genome-wide ancient DNA analysis by a median of around 250-fold. So it basically makes it much more precise, allowing us to study an order of magnitude more individuals than previous studies and to obtain new insights about the past. So the kind of argument is that we are now, because of our enhanced techniques, able to look at more, and that allows us to make more kind of better assertions, better informed assertions. As they suggest, there's a lot of DNA-led investigation into ancient history, previous studies, new insights, intersecting with the disciplines of evolutionary genetics and population genetics. They say, as this next quote, genome-wide analysis of ancient DNA has emerged as a transformative technology for studying prehistory. And again, that word prehistory is kind of interesting here. Providing information that is comparable in power to archaeology and linguistics. So there's a now kind of triumvirate of ways that we might understand the human in prehistory. That is stuff, archaeology, linguistics, language development, and now DNA. Now, this assertion is pretty extraordinary to me. It suggests that DNA science, something which is at present still relatively under-theorised, particularly in historiographical or philosophical terms, is emerging as a key contributor to our understanding and modelling of the past. I know that bioethics exists, I just mean that in this kind of particular instance it hasn't really been, there's not much work been done. The collection of samples, analysis of results and presentation of information is governed clearly by very strict ethical and professional guidelines. These are great world-class scientists. And the high-quality work produced is part of a very particular discourse. Now, it is the case that for decades historians and various types of scientists have interacted to investigate, for instance, disease, environment and weather, emotion, evolutionary psychology, bioarchaeology, and more recently, network analysis and data mining. Many historians are attempting to work out how to engage with and develop new techniques and approaches, kind of interdisciplinary work here. However, this is, I think, to miss the fact that scientists of many hues present their work as history, contributing to a kind of professional amateur discourse in which the highly skilled geneticist can make an extraordinary claim about the human past. Joseph Pickrell and David Reich, who are two leading lights in historical genetics from Yale, wrote a 2014 paper, it's got a brilliant title, Toward a New History and Geography of Human Genes Informed by Ancient DNA. I mean, taking various kind of rhetorical nods from literature and history studies. And they argue in that paper that new technology and analysis techniques lead directly to a new way of understanding human history. Here we go. Because of these technological advances, the past few years have seen a dramatic increase in the quantity of data available for learning about human history. Equally important has been rapid innovation in methods for making inferences from these data. We argue here that the technological breakthroughs of the past few years motivate, this is brilliant, science-ese, motivate a systematic reevaluation of human history using modern genomic tools, a new history and geography of human genes that exploits many orders of magnitude more data than the original synthesis. Again, you can see that already the rhetoric is about more and better. I mean, I don't really want to attack these scientists particularly. That's not my motivation. But there's still a kind of sense that if they can have a better, more precise set of data, they can understand better, which we might argue is true, and true about history as well. So they argue that the ability to track, analyse, investigate in more complexity and greater depth leads to what they call a systematic revaluation of human history. I mean, whatever that means. The DNA that they investigate and the modes of interrogation, the upgrade in technique and the opening up of quantity leads to a richer understanding of how the species develops over time. And their slightly disingenuous phrase, modern genomic tools, suggests somehow that this moment is revelatory, beyond the reach of older science, part of the now. And as I said, I don't really want to attack them over their language, but in their very phrasing, we can find problems of rhetoric and motive that have been argued about vociferously in historiography for the past century. However, the use of the word history by scientists here suggests the excision of the human individual from history, a turning to deep time and evolutionary history that carefully avoids the contemporary. And we take the lessons from these works, they are seeking to reorder our sense of time, by linking the human of now into a much wider chronology. And whilst this is often problematically linear and doesn't take into account all kinds of environmental, contextual, social factors, scientists might rightly claim that an ability to understand the development of the species has more objectivity than other types of approach. Indeed, history is a term regularly deployed in scientific communication to consider long-term change and evolutionary shifts. Here are just some, again, really pretty random examples. Ancient mitochondrial DNA in the genetic history of the Eurasian beaver, mitochondrial DNA diversity, genetic structure, and the demographic history of the neotropical otter in Mexico, the evolutionary history of the order Antipatharia, Cnidaria, and Anthozoa hexacoralia, as inferred from mitochondrial and nuclear DNA. That's a coral, apparently, a black coral. These are from around the world. These are from a range of disciplines, from biology to mammalogy, all kinds of different types of kind of sources. Genetic science is establishing a sense of historicity, and obviously, evolutionary history is something we've talked about for years, but this is kind of quite precise, I think, to what they're doing here. It's something which is linear, possibly, structural, networked, factual, and it interacts with evolutionary science, with molecular biology, statistical analysis, and data mining. It's contributing to a definition of time within evolutionary contexts, augmenting our sense of population development, and at its most baroque, arguing for a new way of thinking about humanness, kinship, and history. Whether this is history or not is moot in terms of philosophical definition and discipline. But what I'm concerned with here, and what I'll try and elaborate in the remainder of the paper, is the resonance of this kind of inquiry in the public imagination, and in particular in popular practice. Now, as I said earlier, genealogy is one of the biggest activities on the planet. As David Leventhal has argued, in our time, massive migration and the loss of tangible relics have stimulated interest in genealogy. As a practice, it's supported by massive subscription databases and websites like Ancestry.com, by huge institutions like the National Archives and around the world, big archives, and through a number of TV programs and public history groups. Ancestry.com and the like provide access to millions of records around the world for the user, and an interface which both encourages the construction of vast trees, but also the uploading of data. So you put your pictures up there, you put your information up there, you put images that you've created, and that then gets integrated with archival information and other user information. So there's a massive social network going on. It might be argued, and I'm more than happy to make this argument, is that genealogy is the most influential way that people in the world access their past. And certainly it's the most widespread citizen history activity on the planet. Now, eminent African-American historian Henry Louis Gates Jr. articulates... Louis Gates Jr.? What is he? I'm going to say Louis. Henry Louis Gates Jr. articulates a sense of excitement for the family historian, but also the keen problems inherent in the archive. Searching for my ancestry was always a fraught process, always a mix of joy, frustration and outrage, as the reconstruction of history, individually and collectively, must always be for any African American. So for Louis Gates Jr., engaging with the archive is a fraught process that will often be frustrating. He comfortably conflates individual and collective history here, suggesting a close relationship between both. In place of the archive, he publicly placed his faith in science, and his TV series In Search of Our Roots and Finding Your Roots used DNA sequencing to enable participants to look beyond the state collection of data. Now, consequently, this work might be placed to critique state organisation of knowledge. The archive, implicitly, is inherently racist, sexist, geographically biased, interested only in heteronormative Eurocentric information. Louis Gates Jr. went further, arguing in one of the more remarkable statements of any historian ever, I think. For the first time since the 17th century, we are able, symbolically at least, to reverse the Middle Passage. Advances in DNA and in the digital organisation of information ensured that, quote, when the paper trail would end, as it inevitably did in the horrid darkness of slavery, we traced our African roots through our DNA. Clearly as well, here echoing the language of Alex Haley and his very influential book Roots and then TV series Roots. Science here brings light to the previously shadowy, a humanist intervention that somehow surmounts the trauma of slavery and enables African Americans to access types of identity that had been previously denied them. And this had serious historiographical consequence, in his opinion. Restoring the stories of the lives of the members of our extended families can directly transform the way that historians reassemble the larger narrative of the history of our people. And that kind of sense of the larger narrative of the history of our people is what I think the scientists think they're doing. Yeah, that's the structure of their kind of investigation, or at least their rhetoric. Louis Gates' words here, particularly this idea of reversal, are very strong and very polemic. What's at stake is participation in history, the reinsertion of an entire set of people who have been intentionally effaced. On this model, old-fashioned genealogy might be read as a problematic discourse. It participates in the effacement and marginalisation of an entire race. It serves as a constant reminder of absence. It's the instrument of Eurocentric racism, taxonomising an entire set of peoples as invalid, historically stateless. In this sense, it's an historiography of power. It determines the fixity of identity grounded in participation in particular discourses: statehood, class, gender, race. Yet it's also something to be sought. Louis Gates Jr. wishes to participate and is frustrated when he cannot. Somehow genealogical visibility is a validating discourse. The archive might be adjusted and new information might be added. And the intervention, therefore, of new techniques might enable the reconciling of trauma a healing of selfhood, a move toward a kind of completeness, the reversal. Even a symbolic reversal of the middle passage is better than no reversal of the middle passage. As he argues in his 2014 show, Finding Your Roots, the series deconstructs categories of race and ethnicity with cutting-edge DNA analysis and old-fashioned archival research. And I love this idea that DNA analysis can deconstruct categories of race and ethnicity. They have that effect, that political effect. And the combination of techniques, therefore, archival research, DNA analysis, allows for an undermining of oppressive structures. Now, so this example is not particularly unusual now, and many websites offer DNA testing. Increasingly, genealogy is being supplemented in the social imaginary with DNA testing and models of scientific process. There is, in fact, an entire industry based around this type of testing and an international society for genetic genealogy, which exists primarily to promote the use of DNA techniques in genealogical research. And DNA testing for genetic genealogy seeks to look at aspects of the DNA sequence for evidence of ancestry. Testing for genealogical purposes follows several routes. And I don't know if you remember, there used to be an advert on TV for shampoo, where I think it was even thingy from Friends said, "Here comes the science part. Here comes the science part." I'm going to take you through the 3 ways that you would use DNA testing for ancestry. So there's quite a lot of long words here. So hold on to your hats. Why DNA testing? This looks for the Y chromosome that's passed from father to son. And a sequence created focuses on particular markers that are useful for distinguishing between peoples. Sequence is then compared with other users in a massive database to suggest connections. And then you add surname information, and this might lead to immense numbers of new connections to be constructed in multiple new configurations. So, for instance, FamilyTreeDNA.com claims to be the biggest database in the world of this type of information, with about 700,000 records. And paternal ancestry lines can then be mapped geographically and genographically. And this kind of testing, kind of patrilineal, is the type that's most prevalent in the popular imagination as a paternity test. That's kind of daytime TV staple. So that's one. Matrilineal or mtDNA testing is sometimes described as a deep ancestry test. It has its roots in the work of Brian Sykes, an Oxford geneticist who wrote a book called 7 Daughters of Eve, in which he claimed that the history of the world could be revealed by genetics. Sykes argued that 95% of Europeans could trace their maternal roots to one of 7 originary mothers who lived between 160 and 200,000 years ago. There are 36 Eves around the world, and most of them are then related to a final mitochondrial Eve, one figure, they argue. So his organisation is a spin-off from Oxford University that pioneers the use of mtDNA to investigate genealogy. mtDNA testing shows which of your haplogroups you are in, when basically your maternal family left Africa, they claim. Their argument goes that everyone in the same clan is a direct maternal descendant of one of these clan mothers and carries her DNA within every cell of their body. And these are the kinds of tests that are often being used in the evolutionary work that I discussed a bit earlier. So there's those. Then there are tests for ethnicity and biogeography, which are widespread but controversial, generally working on haplotypes, again, matrilineal DNA, and finding out much more kind of detailed information about the matrilineal DNA. Biogeography and phylogeography provide a statistical suggestion for understanding DNA information, i.e. with these results it's likely that you come from this place. Ethnicity testing suggests membership of defined groupings. And the performance of selfhood here, I think, is pretty fascinating. DNA sequencing can discern familial relationships within history. It can outline ethnicity. So it challenges or changes the model of the self, suggesting that deep within our genes is a different person, or hundreds of different people. I just read Nicola Griffith's book Ammonite, which was published in 1990, which has this idea of kind of matrilineal history, which is felt by all the women who live on who have undergone some kind of virus and their DNA has changed. And I think there's this kind of clear sense in the imagination of this stuff that there are thousands of people or our ancestors within us simultaneously. Either that, or we're a statistical anomaly. I mean, we're either the end of some kind of shift, or we're nothing really. Sorry, I'm digressing. Yes, sorry. Deep within our genes, then, the suggestion is that there is a different person, one undefined by contemporary social ordering, somehow transhistorical, related to a particular branch of humanity through ties that are unseen to the naked eye and only understood by science or in the clinic. So how has this been understood in popular culture? The most famous examples tend to work through the most common deployment of DNA testing and revelation. And what I'm going to try and do is show you a little clip of this guy who is really very unpleasant. His name is, what's his first name? Sorry, Craig Cobb, and he is a white supremacist. If this works. Or if it doesn't work.
It worked earlier, didn't
It did work earlier.
Ah.
Right, I haven't got this, so you have to hear from here. You see what I mean?
So Craig Cobb. Craig Paul Cobb has undergone DNA testing to determine genetic ancestry. 86% European and
Give it to him. Give it to him.
14% Sub-Saharan African.
She's having a great time.
This is called statistical noise.
Sweetheart, you have a little black in you.
Yeah.
I'll tell you this, oil and water don't mix.
So, hey, bro.
I mean, it's kind of an extraordinary moment in all kinds of ways. I'm not really sure what to make of it, really. So this is in 2013, so a couple of years ago. He has subsequently challenged the science and argues that it was wrong. Whatever. The clip raises some very serious ethical issues about the sharing of biological information, on the assumption of ethnic equivalence, and the willful misrepresentation of statistical information, whether you agree with him or not, which I'm pretty sure we don't, and it's hard to feel sorry for him, and his information was rendered voluntarily. The sequence participates in a kind of discourse of public shaming, using science as the proof of his hypocrisy. Trish's victorious, and slightly ribald comment, "You have a little black in you, bro," points out that he's both genetically related to her, but also, whatever that means at that level, but also illustrates the way that DNA is seen as somehow internal, an unseen identity that is occulted from our day-to-day sense of ourselves. And certainly there's something interesting about a technique which is most famously used by African Americans to reclaim an identity that the archive denies them, being used here to attack a racist figure. Now, Cobb's need to be biologically white and pure highlights one of the problems about genetic popular discourse on ethnicity. There's been much controversy amongst scientists regarding DNA testing for genealogy, and this relates both to the uncertainty of any conclusions that might be drawn and also to the ways in which the test results are presented to users. Population genetic ancestry models for interpreting DNA results have been much criticised for giving wildly inaccurate assurances. DNA inheritance is incredibly complex and businesses simplify it. They also ignore multiple other markers or genomic information because they're too difficult to read. My friends who are geneticists say that what happens when you get your DNA sequence is such a minimal amount of work that might be done on your DNA that it is purposeless, really, as a thing to do. Other concerns by scientists relate to the accuracy of the archive, the partiality of the testing, problems with sampling strategies, and the sacrifices made for commercial gain. In particular, there's much controversy regarding this kind of testing for ethnicity and for the way that DNA might relate to identity. And a lot of the controversy regarding DNA testing for ethnicity surrounds the fact that it imposes a certain socio-historical context onto information that does not bear such a reading. Bolnick and various other authors of this paper, which is now about 10 years old, make this case. Current understandings of race and ethnicity reflect more than genetic relatedness, though having been defined in particular socio-historical contexts, i.e. European American colonialism. In addition, social relationships and life experiences have been as important as biological ancestry in shaping individual identity and group membership. They also argue that databases of present-day samples might provide false leads. DNA information in this view sits to a certain extent outside of human history. That's to say, it is trans-historical to a certain extent, or that's how they view it. And that our understanding of population and the social organisation are not able to comprehend it. So the argument is really that science is here and history is here, and never the twain shall really meet, because there's no place for them to meet. They don't have the same vocabulary or language. DNA sits outside of history as a process of time. The information that DNA encodes could maybe, if we had the knowledge, tell a particular narrative, but at present our understanding is very partial. Accurately understanding the markers of an individual's DNA is incredibly difficult. DNA testing provides a deep sense of deep time. As I mentioned, empty DNA testing demonstrates a common ancestor maybe 200,000 years ago. Y-DNA testing, that's male DNA testing, can take you back to maybe 240,000 years ago. Autosomal DNA, which is much more precise DNA, could and other parts of the genome can also take you maybe to 1 million years ago. Can't be right. I'll have to check that. It's important to note that the religious aspect of this DNA sourcing, suggesting that the individual moves toward a revelation of knowledge and the retrospective ordering of the chaos of the past into something that contributes to the present. It enables the membership of a new order, a new self born from scientific investigation of that which was inside all along. Kind of revelation of self. Bunyan sort of talks about this when he in Grace Abounding. Imaginatively, it doesn't use the word DNA. Imaginatively, DNA sequencing works to construct a non-negotiable relationship. Whilst textual material might lie or be lacking, the DNA test in the popular imagination is basic proof. It suggests a surety of information. It challenges the archive, positing the validity of what is to be found in the body over what is found or not in the archive. It challenges, therefore, a particular model of state organisation and through that of national identity. Genetic genealogy continually undermines the idea of nation, modernity, history. And DNA testing suggests an overriding concern with origin. This type of testing illustrates that identity in the present might not be fixed as one might want it to be. It undermines assurances of selfhood and fragments the assurances of now. And one of the consequences of this clip that I showed you was that Craig Cobb's house got set on fire by his friends because they thought he was no longer white. These examples suggest that deep within anyone lies the possibility of a different identity, indeed the probability of limited origin. In deep DNA time, all human beings are related to each other and descended from the same communal mothers. DNA testing, therefore, forces a shift in understanding of one's self in relation to time. If it has any meaning, then the self must establish somehow, through the sequence of genetic materials, a relationship with changes that took place over millennia. It also demands a sense of the individual within a wider process. If contemporary identity might depend on a sense of the relationship to the other that is the past, DNA sequencing suggests a lack of identity. We're all just a collection of genes sequenced in particular orders with little agency or awareness. We're just bits of acid. DNA testing seemingly circumvents the organisation of the bureaucratic state, denying its hierarchical ordering and its exemplarity in the archive. It writes back into history those who have been forgotten due to lack of textual evidence, but introduces a new epistemological understanding of the modern self's relationship to the past, not governed by the bureaucratic state and the evidence of that kind of institution, but instead by sequences of genes. Selves can be imagined in new ways and the relationship to the past is reordered. Now, irrespective of its accuracy, scientifically or otherwise, DNA testing has warped the understanding of genealogy and hence of our relationship to the past irrevocably. So, DNA sequencing has been a tool of genealogical investigation and is part of a suite of ways of imagining a physical, material relationship to the past. What AncestryDNA.com and the other websites seek is the creation of a live social network based upon DNA sequences. Through social media software, types might be matched, so you put your information in and then you basically become part of this big network. And Ancestry.com seek to enable the ordinary person to participate in this reclamation of identity. The archive increases through each user depositing their sequence within it. It depends on that. Like Facebook, there's no point having Facebook if people aren't part of Facebook. This network only works if the network is there. You can't have a database of DNA without it. The software then matches users and suggests relationships that are previously unknown, and the kind of point of this is that you might find someone that you're related to that you didn't know about. So this is basically online social organisation through the comparison of genes. And it seems to me an unprecedented medicalisation of such relationships. One might label it gene book or Twitter. Furthermore, it embodies new definitions of labour associated with, for instance, prosumption and online community. So theorists of Facebook, for instance, talk about prosumption as the content of Facebook, which is the stuff that gets them money because they sell advertising, is created by the user, but they're prosumers, a consumer and producers at the same time. So this is even more complicated in the case of DNA databases. As part of a suite of me-centered social practices, which is how we might theorize social networks at present, the DNA sequence renders the internal self as part of social media models, the ultimate selfie. As I've argued elsewhere, the use of genealogical information online by big providers is part of a retrospective privatisation of public historical space. Historical information is made to work for profit. It's mined. Analysis turned through this metaphor into a capitalist model of extraction and use. We do this, we data mine, right? And we also need to think carefully about the implications of big data and this kind of enormity of data. The numbers, the type of information being accessed in particular ways for particular ends. What happens to these thousands of trees in the networks? What does it mean about the contemporary historical imagination that that's how information is ordered? How does this contribute to an historical imaginary predicated upon the archive? And what's the kind of importance of the family tree? The tree is this kind of model of linearity. Not only is the user's work being commodified, as we might be commodified by writing stuff on Facebook, at this point their genetic coding and that of their ancestors becomes commodity. The dead are resurrected through DNA sequencing to mean again, in terms of their relationship to others in the contemporary moment, but also to earn again. The body of the contemporary user is valued. It's cost you about $70 to get your basic DNA sequence, about £40. The value of their DNA is in the work it undertakes in contributing to the material archive. So you pay twice. You pay to get it done, and then you pay with the labour of your DNA or your body. The personalisation of historicised identity that is occurring here imagines the user archivally and physically, and it also seeks to reveal relationships hitherto undisclosed, rerouting the individual in the contemporary back through the past and then back into the now. So it's a kind of network linearity. The connection between people is a network event constructed by the algorithm, matching two possible users. So I've been thinking quite carefully about how this science becomes a new type of narrative. DNA testing is a particular type of explicit contrast with day-to-day genealogical investigation. I think they are two separate things. DNA testing, for instance, celebrates the linear rather than the cross-sectional, precludes a variety of connections. Popular use of DNA testing for ethnicity and genealogy might suggest that DNA has an identity outside of history and provide resistance to modern identity definitions. And this is what Henry Louis Gates Jr. is thinking about when he uses it. It allows a circumvention of traditional history, the construction of an alternative type of selfhood, and renders maybe a fundamental humanness back to the user. But this seems to be in contrast to actual kind of classic genealogy in many ways. So as I promised, I'm going to give you a brief case study to conclude. Me, I'm here. You've been looking at my DNA all along, as it were, and its organisation.
And we're all claiming a relationship.
Exactly. Well, you're all related to me. I'm sorry. Statistically, it's just true. So I thought we'd briefly finish by thinking about this, and yeah, I'm in my research. Here we go. So in April of last year, I offered to write a blog for Ancestry.com about this very issue, because I wanted to have a conversation with them about it. And they gave me a free test, so full disclosure, in order that I might do this and tie in with their launch of the service in the UK. Now, so putting myself in my research is something that I find quite ethically challenging and something I've never really attempted to do. But I felt it was quite important in this instance to understand this effective relationship to what's going on, why people might do this. And as I say, it was definitely a case of putting my research money where my mouth was. It was pretty underwhelming, I have to say, if anyone's ever done this. You basically get a little tube with a swab in it, and you take a swab from your mouth and then you put it into the mail. It felt very, very throwaway, very clinical. I felt very odd doing it because I didn't really know why I was doing it. I was quite sceptical and quite. I don't know what I was. We might explore why I was so confused by this later. And when I got the results back, I was quite worried about this as well. I put it in the mail without really thinking about it, and I hadn't told my mum or my dad I was doing it, or any of my family I was doing it. And I suddenly thought, what happens if something does come back? And it turns out, I'm half Navajo Indian, or whatever. But also, with the reviso that I recognised and knew that it probably meant absolutely nothing. So the process was quite amazing and also underwhelming at the same time. And I'm not totally sure that it changed much about myself or how I feel about myself, but it certainly shifted something. This is my ethnicity estimate. Not quite as European or Central Western European as Craig Cobb, but I don't have any Sub-Saharan African in me, apparently. I could have told you this. Basically, a little discussion with my mum and my dad about my great grandparents, and that's what you get. But my great grandma's from Ireland. My opa, my granddad, is from the Netherlands. The rest of my family are from the northeast, which is where you get the Finnish bit, I would imagine. My maternal great grandfather was Italian. This I don't know where this, but presumably, my maternal grandparents lived up in the northeast in Tyneside for a long time, so that's where you get kind of some traffic. But it's about as European as it's humanly possible to be. Literally humanly possible to be. As you can see, this is my ethnic map. So I love the range here because it's a brilliant way of visualising it, that you overlay onto a modern political map these kinds of groupings, including the sea, obviously, which is and then the kind of
half man, half fish.
This is the horrible thing I found there. This overlap here. And also, this is not in any way explained. You get this information. These are basically the two things you get. It's like, what? So I'm really interested by the kind of the promise of giving these answers, and then really not very much information. You don't
part
get.
Of Ukraine do you belong to?
Well, yeah, exactly. Why is there a kind of
You're a bit on this.
Yeah, very well. So am I Russian, basically, nowadays. So it's very complicated in terms of what it actually means. And what I thought was most problematic, as you can see, is this lack of interpretative information. The fact that this is ready visualized for you. This is the answer already without you having any interaction with the information. So most traditional genealogical research, the user will gain some kind of archival ability, some semi-professional techniques at reading stuff, and will start to make their own decisions. This, you don't get anything like that. You just get the answer as it is interpreted for you. So I find that quite interesting. This visualization doesn't really contribute anything. It's a set of closed statements that aren't interpretative in any way. Also, it becomes, if you delve into it a little bit, quite complicated in terms of what's going to happen subsequently to the DNA information that you have given and rendered up. This is what Ancestry does. You asked me to sign that earlier. This is what Ancestry says. If you spit in a tube, this is what happens. So DNA Testing Society, this analysis is done for genetic and genealogical research, and not for medical or diagnostic purposes. Fine. They will use aggregated users' results to make discoveries. So you're part of a massive research project, maybe, in the study of take deep breath, genealogy, anthropology, genetics, evolution, languages, cultures, medicine, and other topics. It's like this amazing crowdsourcing of something. So there is this, and Ancestry publish papers. If you go onto their website, there are papers about. But the papers are weird because you look on them and they look like scientific papers, but they have no information about where the work's been done. They've got none of the stuff that you would associate with a scientific paper, and they don't say where the people who wrote the paper are based. So who knows? It gets more complicated. By submitting your DNA, you give Ancestry and group companies perpetual, royalty-free, worldwide, transferable license to use your DNA. In the form or context we deem appropriate, through any media or medium, with any technology or devices now known or hereafter developed or discovered, subject to the... to be honest, this is basically signing away your DNA, which I find incredibly complicated. Now, what they also don't really point out is that you're signing away the information that's encoded in your DNA, which is not, it's easy to get hold of people's DNA. But the information you're given is nowhere near as complicated as what they might be able to take out of your DNA if they wished to. So you're kind of getting a very small amount, and they might, if they wish to, get a very large amount, and you wouldn't know that was being looked at. So what does this teach us? Apart from the fact that it's very odd. Well, it teaches us that it's a very different thing to other genealogical inquiry. It's a different process, it's a different set of data, it's a different approach. Reading this information, such as it is, demands a different set of skills. And it sort of suggests, so if we think the amateur historian, the family historian, the genealogical historian is a type of historian that we might want to theorise, we're now starting to think about the DNA historian or the genetic historian and what that might mean historiographically, professionally. I think is quite interesting. It's an augmentation in this case, but it might become something more in years to come. Where genealogy often gives the tools of investigation to the amateur user and encourages them to gain skills, for instance in paleography or in archival techniques, DNA testing, as I've said, is a blunt instrument with no interrelation or interaction. It can't be hacked, it can't be shared, it can't be used in a particularly constructive way. I wanted to see my DNA, as it were, or at least the numbers in my DNA. This is a problem. Scientists say this all the time. You can't visualise DNA. People make DNA into all kinds of things, into music, into sculpture, but it's actually the thingness of DNA is nearly impossible to really understand. So it seems to close down investigation in many ways. It opens up a big data aspect of genealogy, reminding the user of their individual insignificance. In this, I am irrelevant to the bigger picture. But it doesn't really help very much. But at the same time, it creates digital intimacy. As I said, this is the social media network. This is my possible match that came up, and so this user emailed me and said, I think we're related to one another. And it actually turns out that she is my mum's third cousin, so she is more related to me than you might be. Most DNA tests say you might meet someone who is fourth to sixth cousin. Now, fourth to sixth cousins statistically is pretty much you people around the table. So it's kind of an odd thing to suggest that that's what it is. And this is what even Ancestry will point out is kind of common genetic inheritance. You start out with these people here, and you get down here, very far down, very small bits that might have some kind of connection. Many generations later, distant cousins, basically. So to conclude, I'm sorry to be. Thank you for your. For letting me put myself in this. The entry of DNA testing into genealogy, I think, means a conceptual shift, a clear movement away from the archival toward the clinical, and I think we as public historians need to be quite aware that this is happening. In many ways, it fundamentally shifts the emphasis from the archive to the self, to the body, to the individual, maybe. Although that individual is imagined within a much wider historical and biological scope. The archive, such as it is, becomes more personalised, part of the self rather than distanced from them. And I mean, just about access, like there's this idea that you go to the archive and you find stuff. You search the archive, you're a detective in the archive, you're seeking, you're finding your roots or whatever. Whereas DNA testing seems to suggest it's there all along, and you just have to look in the right place, or you just have to have the right tools. It's a different kind of model, I think. The investigation of the past is no longer related to text, but to the body, and there's a shift from the uncertainties of the humanities archive to the stability of the scientific one. As argued earlier, science is more than comfortable working with a set of data that are uninvestigated and under-theorised from the point of view of historiography or ethics, but it seems clear that there's a kind of imaginative archive that's being constructed, a literal DNA archive that's being constructed, which hasn't been interrogated in any way or collected in any kind of ethical or methodologically astute way, which is, I think, fascinating. And what I think we're seeing to a certain extent, and I've tried to find a way of not making this an ugly set of phrasing, is the historicising of science. So the scientists who I quoted earlier are starting to think very clearly about the contribution that their science makes across to our historical understanding, and also, concomitantly, the sciencing of history.